Prologue. Macorin strode aimlessly through the aftermath of the last battle of his life. The land was parched dry and cracked. A flat barren landscape stretched beyond sight. It was littered with tall heaps of rotting corpses. The stench of rotting meat filled the hot, windless air. There were hundreds of thousands of the dead, maybe millions. He didn't know how many, honestly. What was one undead slave among so many? The Blood Gauntlets, the Void Triangle specialist sect of necromancers, corpse manipulators, and summoners, had enjoyed an era of blood revelry. They made artifacts from the dead. They aided the masters in entering the world, and every living human was a slave in their eyes. They created shambling ghouls by the thousands, only slightly less of the crazed blood drinkers, a few hundred of the vengeful, terrifying revenants, and even a lich. Macorin kicked the burned head of a dead ghoul. Blood and brain matter splashed against his shiny black boot. His large chest heaved a sigh of celebration's end. His almost colorless eyes surveyed the ruins of the armies that the Void Triangle once commanded. His tiny black pupils, in milky white, shifted from one heap to another. He remained careful not to disturb the ash piles, as these were likely the remains of their masters, now returned to the Great Mother, Oblivion. As he looked, Macorin's eyes had to tolerate the glare of the sun. He would have liked something to strangle as he thought on it. For over a decade, most of the world was covered in perfect blackness. The darkness blocked out the uncomfortable light of the sun. During that time, his powers of shadow reached an apex he didn't know existed. His mind was so focused and clear, it felt as though he was becoming a god, with so many souls swallowed up into his will. How could he believe otherwise? Macorin looked down at another corpse, and a smile played on his cold, blue lips. The body belonged to the King of Terrell. The former ruler had been killed, reanimated, and brought halfway across the world. His final end was in the middle of the Kassaran Empire, thousands of miles and an ocean away from his farming kingdom. The entire world was so very nearly nothing more than their collective source of unlimited power. This king and his nation were the third kingdom conquered by the order of the Void Triangle. Terrell was home to the healers and geomancers of the Earth Phoenix clan. Of the 4 remaining mage clans, they had been the second easiest to wipe out. Their greatest challenge was the Crimson Imperial Flames, the Kassaran Emperor's personal combat magi. They were violent, brutal, and well-trained. The Hellfire-imbued sect had enjoyed literally fighting fire with fire against them. In the darkness, the Crimson Imperial's fire clashed with the purple, blue, and emerald fires of the sect's annihilation worms. It was their favorite and most devastating hellfire spell. In some places, Macorin could still see the mile-wide trenches of black glass where the worms left a path of burning destruction. In the end, the Imperial Magi were also defeated, burned away until not even their souls remained. Macorin pulled the hood of his long black cloak forward, giving his cold, pale face more shadow for comfort. He rubbed his short-trimmed auburn beard, feeling the accursed sunlight spill into the sleeves of his black tunic and onto his bulky arms. "Macorin Eternal!" came an intrusion from behind. Macorin turned his bear-sized body to face the lanky, tall shape of a youth. He was anything but the grinning child he seemed. He wore the traditional black tunic, pants, boots, and gloves. His long black cloak draped his back and down to his heels. The hood was pulled forward, hiding his colorless eyes and short, white blonde hair. "Great Mother embrace you, Hellfire Emil." Macorin greeted the leader of the Hellfire Imbued. "What brings you to my melancholy retrospect?" Emil was generally a playfully giddy pyromaniac. Macorin thought his remark would earned some crazed, optimistic retort. The boy's pale face was set and grim, though. It even seemed it would stay that way a while.
"The Oblivion emissary wishes to speak with all of us,"
Emil answered as dispassionately as he could manage. Makorin, leader of the Shadows Eternal, nearly supreme patriarch of the Void Triangle, wasn't as successful at hiding his anger. His gloves creaked as his fists clenched. His teeth grinded. "I think we should speak indeed." Makorin usually held back his feelings behind a cold facade. It was part of his training to emulate the part of the underworld he would wield. Soul Theorist translated. Feast of Souls was a pitch-black hunting ground. There, the greatest of attacks and madness. In Soul Theorist, terror was the absolute ruler. But this last battle, this ending, stoked hot fires of rage in Makorin that were better suited for a hellfire imbued. "I want to know why we were told to hold back against an enemy that was cutting us to ribbons!" Makorin growled as he followed Emil back to the massive command pavilion. Makorin knew that his complaints would be lost on Emil. Though his fervor for hellfire remained unchanged, something caused him to become more devoted to the Little Prophet. It happened all at once and very recently. When Makorin brought it up, Emil was at a loss for a reason. It seemed the Prophet gave the young hellfire imbued an almost religious zeal, but took away the memory of why. Makorin wanted to know how a speaker for the Masters could perform such a flawless manipulation of the mind. After half an hour of walking around the piles of bodies, carefully avoiding the ashes, they finally arrived at the pavilion. It was several stories tall and half a mile wide all around. It was almost made of black material that blocked both the heat and light of the sun. Though it was as large as a small palace, a number of Void Disciples managed its location and storage within seconds. Emil turned to face Makorin.
"I know it all looks bleak, Makorin Eternal, but have a little faith."
Makorin couldn't tolerate the young fanatic's rhetoric. "Hellfire Emil, every Void Disciple is trained with the knowledge that faith is one of many illusions. It is used by those with delusion of power to abuse those they view as inferior. I expect better of you than absurdly blind devotion. Such self-abusive notions are exactly why I abandoned the Emerald Spectre clan."
"Do you acknowledge the goal of the Great Mother?"
Emil challenged calmly. Makorin blinked as if struck. The question was posed to new Void Disciples by the voices of their masters in the underworld. It was asked as a way to measure commitment. The goal of the Great Mother, the primordial essence of nothingness, was the end-all of life and death, a return to perfect stillness. Until that goal was achieved, the children of nothing, those that people called demons, were free to do as they wished, so long as it furthered the goal. It was the same for their students, the Void Disciples. "That's a foolish and poorly misplaced question, Hellfire Emil," Makorin growled. "My ambitions are always on the interests of the Great Mother and her goal. Do not think to take me."
"He does no such thing, Makorin Eternal,"
came a cracking voice from within the pavilion. The voice belonged to a short, stick-thin man, wearing a hooded robe so red it was almost black. His eyes were shadowed, but his mouth was a broken, toothy, cracked, endless grin. His madness was as tangible in aura as the rotting flesh and sulfur. "Emissary." Makorin inclined his head in a bow.
"That's a half-hearted gesture from you, Shadow Eternal. Give me no respect I do not earn. Speak your mind."
That was the only floodgate Makorin needed open. "The Magus Warrior King sliced us to bits, and you forbid us from combining our powers to crush him. This didn't need to be a defeat that the rest of the world could seize upon."
"How are your skills growing, Makorin Eternal?"
the Prophet challenged. The question seemed obscenely out of place and off-balancing. My capacities were growing in leaps and bounds until today.
Can you chasm walk? The prophet pushed.
Macorin didn't know what was more baffling, that the prophet held knowledge that belonged only to void disciples, or that he was referring to purely theorized skills. The chasm walk would allow a Shadow Eternal to walk the distance between worlds.
Can you sunblight?
The prophet pressed, still grinning with mischief.
Do we have any who can call on the burning scour? Or the enslaving winds?
Macorin had had enough of the little prophet.
No, and none among us can cause a rain of gold, turn the moon back in the east, or catch a falling star with their teeth either. We were still powerful enough to bring this world to its knees.
The prophet's grin widened, exposing yellow, jagged teeth. His feet lifted off the ground, and he was close enough to Macorin that he could see the mad gleam in his bloodshot yellow eyes.
Can you escape execution with the repulsing word?
The prophet challenged in a playful, hissing whisper. Of all of the skills the prophet listed, that last ceaselessly vexed the Shadow Eternals faction for more than 5 generations. It was a ward that reversed any form of death. It was a true gift of immortality. But there was a balance and precision required that was tenuously dangerous. Void disciples always lost more of their soul to their own magic, but the loss in the ward could be sudden and total. It often left behind raving, violent husks. Their memories and their thinking could be so absent, leaving nothing of the person warded. It was supposed to be gradual, only a little at a time, but no one perfected the cost of each resurrection. So far, everyone who had cast the ward were nothing more than rabid, soulless animals after their first death. Fortunately, their madness was so thoughtless that it was easy to strip away the ward and put them out of their misery.
No,
Macorin growled between clenched teeth.
Then you admit your capacity to serve the Great Mother is limited. No one here can do what needs to be done. You can silence this world, to an extent, but no other world will be returned to silence. The infinite eternity of the afterlife will never be washed away by anyone here.
Macorin felt his failure keenly. He could find no repose for the Oblivion Emissary. His accusations were correct. He could be a king over millions of souls, but how would that repay his masters, or the Great Mother? Just as any void disciple, the absence of his own soul created a craving to return to the Great Mother. Yet he had no viable path to attain that goal.
Take heart, Lord of the Gathering Shade,
the prophet reassured, using Macorin's formal title.
If there was no solution available, I would have allowed you to overwhelm the King of Demon Slayers. Come, join your brothers and sisters, and I will share a vision that will truly renew your faith in our dark path.
Macorin entered the colossal pavilion beside the Oblivion Emissary. A truly monumental event awaited him. Chapter 1. The Earth remembers when everyone forgets. In the previous months, there were deep ensnaring drifts of snow that left the streets empty and silent. Families huddled indoors, seeking warmth from fire or each other. Weaker huts and hovels collapsed, casting families into the bitter cold. The already meager food stores were gone, leaving them to wonder if they would freeze or starve first. The starvation passed when the king's personal retainers were dispatched to distribute loaves of bread to the families. Now only the remains of fallen huts and the gouged earth told winter's tale. About a week ago, the rains began, gently wearing down the ice and snow, eroding the last of the bitter season. Wooden buckets were placed in the rain, collecting water that would be clean enough to drink. Now the pail and the snow were gone, and only the round depressions in the clay-like mud told of the merciful rain. Rylan was only a boy of 14 years, so it was a simple thing to forget a season's torment. He barely remembered how the generous loaves of bread were never dispersed in previous years. He forgot about cramped muscles or an aching belly. He only understood that the sun was soothingly warm on his light-tanned skin, It was good to let his wiry legs step so carefree in the streets. The rays of sunshine and the bustle in the streets brought a smile to his narrow face, further creating the illusion of a glow in his brilliant blue eyes. He was here to retrieve a spade and a tilling hoe for his father, and a basket of seeds for his mother. In previous years, none of these were present. The farmers always used whatever rocks and sticks would break the soil. They often carried handfuls of seeds for miles. Ryland's father told him the king won an argument against the nobles on their behalf. King Malaric would do so much more if he could. Ryland's mother added that the king only needed practical arguments that would win over the self-interests of the nobility. The outskirts, as they were called, were a series of huts and low mud hovels nestled a mile away from the edge of the capital city of Pollinsor. At last, Ryland found a thick throng of villagers. They were surrounding a high-walled cart, warded by a pair of brightly colored soldiers. They held their halberds loosely as they glanced about with boredom. Between the two disinterested guards, a pair of garishly dressed merchants distributed the promised implements from the cart. Their faces displayed barely concealed contempt and disgust. The merchant's displeasure for the outskirts could not extinguish the sense of relief or joy that filled the air. This planting season would be far easier and more fruitful than any before. There was certain to be excess in the harvest. The farmers might hold greater food stores for the next winter. Men and women were crowded, patiently waiting for the new tools. Ryland was the only child in evidence, and the other farmers allowed him to move freely. They gently urged him forward, with a smile in greeting. The other children would be playing in the woods between the village and in the fields to the south, staying close enough for their parents' liking. Ryland held few similarities with boys his age. Many of them were his friends, true, but he spent much of his time helping his mother and father however he could. For now, this meant they would be able to find a patch of field and prepare it, while he fetched their implements. They wouldn't be able to do much else, but his effort allowed them to rest before their toils began. And that was enough for him. Ryland was close to the cart now. He stood still and closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the pleasant warmth of the sun soothing his scalp under his long, shining black hair. Heat gathered between his drooping patchwork shirt and pants and his stick-thin body. His skin barely concealed his bones with little bumps of muscle from labor, but that was scarcely different from any other farmer. His hide shoes were so worn and aged that he no longer felt the blisters or cuts from walking unprotected. But Ryland didn't think of these things that marked his impoverished life. It was a warm start of spring. He had eaten more today than the last 2 months, and farming was about to become easier for everyone. It felt like a very promising day to him. At last, Ryland stood before a short round man in a maroon velvet doublet and hideously tight leggings.
"Go away, urchin. I have nothing for children here," the man growled irritably.
"I am here in place of my mother and father, sir. They are making ready a patch of field." The rotund merchant rolled his brown eyes before forcibly retrieving a shovel, hoe, and basket from his cart and shoving them angrily at Ryland.
"Whatever gets you to cease wasting my time?" He turned, grumbling with annoyance.
Ryland began a measured run to the edge of the village. He resisted the impulse to close his eyes as he fast approached the cemetery to the south. The spring, the tools, and the fresh food lessened the memory of the bitter winter. The fresh shallow graves mounded at the edge of the village were a constant, painful reminder. The winter claimed 20 lives before departing. Half of them were infants too weak to withstand the hunger or the cold. Mothers and fathers often went into the harsh blizzards simply to gather rocks and dig their children's graves with cold, bleeding hands. When he was smaller, it was only a thicket of crossed wooden poles over mounds of dirt. He could no longer ignore the melancholy scent so easily now. His steps slowed slightly, and his smile faded. He wanted to think on the spring, on anything pleasant, but his memory would not yield. During the long nights of the last winter, Ryland lay close to the hearth in the hovel. He heard the moaning of the cold wind seeping through the cracks in the mud and straw. In that wind, he heard a sound that caused him to weep instantly. There was the sound of a woman wailing in the cemetery, unfazed by the cold. The sound of her tormented cries and the moaning wind were like tortured screams of the damned. The pain cut deeply into his being without mercy, as uncaring as the wind it rode in on. The tormented memory was cut abruptly short. Behind Ryland to the east, shouts and commotions filled the air. Unable to resist his growing curiosity, Ryland turned around to investigate. There was another larger crowd of villagers at the eastern edge of the outskirts. It was difficult for Ryland to see behind the thick mass of men and women bunched close. It was harder still to hear anything distinct over the angry shouts. But Ryland didn't need much more than that to understand. The villagers were generally a friendly and enduring people, helping each other and strangers in need. But a rotating shift of miners had returned from the mountains far to the eastern border of Malkanor. That alone would be enough to turn every good mood sour. Ryland could make out the large burly figures swaying drunkenly and towering above the farming villagers. The miners were originally from the outskirts. A long time ago, they would have been greeted with cheers and open arms. It was hoped then that they would mine for greater pay than the farmers could ever dream. For a while, that's what they did. But that changed. The nobles of Malkanor believed paying a silver piece for every mined pound was too generous. To avoid losing their precious money, they established a series of taverns, gambling houses, and pleasure dens at a discreet distance from the iron mines. At first the miners held their earnings, wishing only to help their families. In time, the seduction was too great. The miners began to squander all their earnings. When a new rotation of miners arrived to take their place, forcing them to return home, they came first with the guilt and despair. As this betrayal continued with each shift, they spent money to drink away their guilt. They became drunk and useless, even when they returned home. Their guilt changed into anger, and they lashed out at friends and family alike. Life without the miners in the village was a blessing. Now the farmers simply wanted them gone. Ryland watched as one of the large figures pushed through, shoving men and women aside, moving to the other side of the street. He halted before a middle-aged woman with dark hair, sitting with her hands in her lap. She stared ahead, her bloodshot brown eyes blank, her jaw gaping open. She seemed not to notice the miner towering in front of her. Her mouth twitched as though beginning to form words that would never finish.
"Is that all you've been doing since I've been away?"
His gruff voice demanded, slurring. A faint moan escaped her, and that was when Ryland remembered that this catatonic woman was the one he heard in the late winter nights.
"Have you made a single copper piece at all from those silly dirt piles? Anything for me?"
His voice climbed angrily. She had buried their child alone, while he was away. Ryland knew this man drank and gambled, while she was left alone to her pain. She held no easy escape as he did. Ryland also knew that this miner would beat his wife unless someone intervened. A boy against a giant. Ryland dropped the tilling hook and basket and approached with a spade in his hand. Chapter 2. Ryland remained undetected as he covered the distance in a few steps. He raised the shovel high, but before he could strike, the shaft was caught in a powerful, unyielding grip. Ryland looked up to see a hand as big as his head wrapped around the handle, holding from behind.
"You've a grand heart, Ryland," boomed a friendly low voice, "but you'd better leave this to me."
Ryland was eclipsed in the shadow of a giant, muscled man 4 times as tall as him and 3 times as wide. He wore an oily black leather apron and pants over sweating skin. His back was turned, and Ryland barely saw the few strands of singed auburn hair on his bald head. He raised one scarred and calloused hand to tap the miner on the shoulder, when the miner raised his fist to strike his wife. The miner jumped, startled at the intrusion, and turned around. Without word or further warning, the miner was punched squarely in the face by an arm bigger than the average tree. The miner fell, instantly unconscious before his head hit the ground. Ernik the blacksmith turned away and winked at Ryland with a mirthful blue eye.
"He would have tried to hit me first anyway."
Ryland chuckled. He doubted anyone would have tried to strike the village's beloved smith. Ernik's skills as a blacksmith were without equal for miles. People thought he might have been a smith in another nation. His hands were certainly fast and strong enough for such a career, but he never spoke of it. He refused the better pay and living conditions simply to help the village, where he believed he was needed the most. Ernic's skills were welcomed and appreciated. There was no metal shape he could not craft, and nothing he could not repair. If the smith had the materials, they would all live in cabins and houses instead of hovels and huts. For refusing to sell his skills to the capital, the aristocracy would not allow most iron and metal goods to go to him. So Ernic's help was a meek effort that couldn't improve the village as much as he wanted. He and his daughter Ishel were simply two more peasants in the village.
Ishel has been asking for you, Rylan. I believe she wants another day with you,
Ernic informed pointedly. Ishel and Rylan were friends almost as soon as they were old enough to walk. They dueled with sticks, chased each other, or attempted to catch fish together. Rylan's days playing might not be frequent, but he did enjoy spending time with Ernic's daughter. It was not a boy's attraction for a young girl, though many villagers thought so. His relationship with her was no more than a close sister, and he liked it that way. I've got to help Mother and Father with the planting. I've no time for play. Ernic sighed.
You're a strange one, Rylan. You know Kylor and Liane don't demand this of you.
Rylan nodded, but didn't say he believed his youthful energies were invaluable for the farming effort.
At least come to my forge when the sun is high. Ishel will be there, and you could give her a greeting.
Ernic paused to examine Rylan's spade and hook.
You'd better come over anyways. By the looks of it, the lords have found a loop in the king's orders again. Honestly, wooden pegs at the base of the metal? It'll be a wonder if they last the day. Tell Kylor to be gentle with them until I get a moment with them.
I will. I will return when the sun is high. Rylan promised before he turned away, beginning his run to the fields. Rylan spared no thought for the growing cemetery this time. He possessed no spare movement for anything but his pumping legs and his farming burden. He was a fast runner, and he covered the distance fairly quickly, leaping and ducking in the woods without slowing his pace. Rylan didn't realize how unusual he would appear, running at almost a blurring speed as he effortlessly navigated the dense woods. Within minutes, Rylan stood in the fields and searched for his mother and father. He began to steady his breathing when he spotted his father's long, wild brown hair and his dirty brown clothes. His back was turned so he didn't see Rylan approaching. Rylan didn't see his mother immediately, but as he drew closer, he saw her sitting down in the tall grasses. They were both almost stick-thin figures. His mother was a woman of very graceful beauty that rivaled the highborn ladies. She was clearly the source of his shining black hair, though hers was tied behind her neck before it fell to her lower back. Her brown patchwork dress covered a petite body shape that had once been slender and curved. Her dark skin was marked with labor scars, and her hands were calloused. His father's shape told a very similar tale. His labors forced him to keep some of his younger muscles. His scars and his deeply sun-browned skin were a reflection of his work. His drooping clothes and drawn-tight skin attested to starvation and sacrifice. There was no need to rush, Rylan. The spring has only begun. You could have greeted your friends. Kylor laughed and smiled warmly. There is too much to be done. Rylan shook his head. I'll give it my all now. We need not starve this year. If we make more, they will simply take more, Liane reminded. Don't ignore your friends to work pointlessly. Rylan knew she was right, but he thought they could hide a greater portion of their farmed rewards. He thought it might be possible to talk the village into creating a hidden food cache. Let me help today, Rylan pleaded. Ernic wants to make the spade and hook stronger tonight. When I bring them over, I will tell Ishel I will spend tomorrow with her. Just let me help start the planting. Kylor and Liane shared a considering gaze before Kylor answered.
I suppose there is no talking you out of this, is there?
Rylan shook his head fervently. His father sighed.
Very well, but only if you spend the morrow being your age.
I will, Rylan promised before he picked up the shovel and began spearing and turning the soil around them. Rylan's father followed behind him, breaking the clumps into soft soil while his mother pulled the unwanted grass, tossing it aside. Rylan thought they could accomplish so much simply because they were a united family in their task. Hours passed without notice, and the area they tended grew. The seeds continued to wait for their places in the earth. But Ryland's mother and father would see to that when he returned to the village. He could hear and feel the wood groan at the base of the metal, threatening to crack. It was just as Ernick warned, and Ryland made sure to apply careful pressure. When a cool spring breeze caressed his sweating skin, Ryland looked to the sky and noticed the sun found the center of the sky. A lot of work was complete, but it was not as much as he had hoped for. Regardless, Ryland gathered the hoe and shovel after sharing a brief farewell with his mother and father. Ryland returned to the village and Ernick's forge within an hour. Ishel sat waiting on a makeshift stool, a safe distance from the forge, kicking her bony legs with boredom. Her light brown hair fell to her shoulders, tangled with bits of straw. Her hazel eyes rolled with impatience. Her father was dirt-streaked and lightly sun-darkened. She drummed her fingers to the sound of Ernick's loud, clanging hammer until she saw Ryland standing in front of her. Instantly, her small lips unpursed from a scowl and burst into a cheerful smile. "You're late," Ishel chided. Ryland shrugged but said nothing in his defense. "When spring came, I wanted yours to be the first face I saw," Ishel pouted. "Don't be such a girl about it," Ryland teased. "Anyway, you know the first day of spring is the hardest labor of the season. My ma and da will have aching backs for days without me. If you want to help them so much, then come with me to the river. You can come tomorrow, can't you?" Ryland remembered his promise to his parents and nodded. "Good. Then we can catch lots of fish and our families can eat well." "We don't always have the best luck with fish," Ryland reminded her. "Tisk." Ishel wagged her finger at him. "I have a plan. The fish don't stand a chance."
Cooked fish does sound like a great meal, Ernick chimed in from his forge.
"I'll catch a big fat one for you, father," Ishel vowed, drawing a low chuckle from Ryland. Ryland continued to plan with Ishel, while Ernick improved the tools. He had to admit to himself, it was good to speak and laugh with Ishel after the long isolation of winter. It made him look forward to spending the day together. As Ryland gave the forge a cheerful wave farewell, he allowed himself to bask in the thoughts and memories that gave him the most pleasure.